The author of Chazdei David continues to summarize the teachings of the Arizal with the following insights. Uvein ba'Igulim, uvein Ve-Yosher, yesh bahem kelim. Both the circular Igulim aspect and the linear Yosher aspect of the Partzufim and the Sefirot have vessels. Ve'orot hanikraim atzmut. Additionally, these two aspects also have orot, literally different levels of light, a concept that we'll define in great depth as we go along. And these orot are called the atzmut of the Partzufim and the Sefirot, literally their essence. Venikraim Nephesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, Yechida. And these different levels of light are called Nephesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, and Yechida. Or, as these 5 levels of light are usually abbreviated, Nar Nechi. And now we'll clarify these words step by step. In our previous sessions, we learned and simulated in great detail how and in what order the circular Igulim and the linear Yosher aspects of the 12 Partzufim were formed in each and every world. And we also began to clarify several differences between the circular Igulim and the linear Yosher aspects. But now, the author introduces several details which are applicable to both the circular Igulim and the linear Yosher aspects of the Partzufim and the Sefirot that make up every world. The first detail to be clarified here is that both the circular Igulim and the linear Yosher aspects have 2 distinctions that make up every single circular Igul element and every single linear Yosher element. The first distinction is their kelim, literally their vessels. And of course, it goes without saying that what you see here is only a simulation of a vessel, similar to the physical vessels that we use down here in our physical world. But certainly we don't mean to suggest that the spiritual vessels in the upper worlds have any similarity to the vessel that you see in front of you. Nevertheless, in order to impress our physical brains with some impression of the spiritual concept that the Arizal calls the vessels, I therefore saw it necessary to simulate this image of a vessel to at least start us off. And indeed, when we contemplate upon why the Kabbalists chose to use the concept of a vessel, it seems that their reason for using this parable was probably along the following lines. Just as physical vessels contain inside of them whatever it is that they are designed to contain, be it a physical liquid or a physical solid, so too the function of these spiritual vessels is to contain something spiritual. And this is why we often find that the Zohar calls these vessels mechilin, literally containers, as after all, the primary function of these vessels is to contain something spiritual in them. And what is this spiritual element that the vessels contain called? Well, the author tells us here that these are the orot, literally the different levels of light that the vessels contain. But you should know that even what Kabbalah calls vessels are certainly spiritual entities without any physicality whatsoever. And in fact, you could technically think of these vessels as lights as well, since they are certainly much more ethereal than even our natural sunlight. Nevertheless, since the spiritual vessels are much more coarse than the spiritual orot that they contain, they are therefore called vessels. And in contrast, the even more ethereal spiritual elements that they contain are appropriately called orot, literally light. However, we'll again reiterate that up there in the spiritual worlds, there certainly are no vessels that resemble the type of physical vessels that we have down here in our physical world. Not even like the vessel that I illustrated for you. As the Arizal spelled out in Shar HaKdamot, that certainly up there in the spiritual world, we find only thin, ethereal lights that are completely beyond our human grasp. As the verse in the Torah states, Ki lo reitem kol temunah, referring to when the Almighty warned us that we saw no image in Har Sinai. But in order to understand why the Orot are referred to as the Atzmut, literally the essence of the Sefirot and the Partzufim, we'll have to devote a lengthy discussion, which we'll soon do. But before we do just that, we'll first introduce the 5 levels of spiritual light that the vessels contain. As the author indeed spells out for us, the first level of spiritual light is called Nephesh, and this is the lowest level of light. Following it comes the level called Ruach, and this is the second lowest level of light, as only the Nephesh is lower than the Ruach. Following the Ruach comes the level called Neshama, and this is the third and middle level of light. Following it comes the level called Chaya, and this is the second highest level of spiritual light. Finally, then comes the level called Yechida, which is the highest level of spiritual light from all the Orot that the vessels contain. And more often than not, the Kabbalists usually abbreviate these 5 levels of light and call them Narnechi in short. And even regarding the illustration that you currently see in front of you, I must clarify that this is certainly only a simulation to help us become acquainted with the order and the relationship between these 5 levels of spiritual light. However, by no means are we suggesting that there is any connection between the different levels of light and the colors that I chose to represent each one of them with. And not only that, but you should know that even what I illustrated, the Nephesh, which is the lowest level of light, as the innermost level, compared to the Yechida, which is the highest level of light, as the outermost level, actually this too isn't necessarily so. As in truth, sometimes it is necessary to visualize the Yechida as the innermost level and the Nephesh as the outermost level. However, I chose to illustrate the levels of light in this specific organization in order to help you remember that the Yechida is indeed the highest level of spiritual light, as compared to the Nephesh, which is the lowest level of spiritual light. Now, we'll focus upon the question that we previously skipped over. Why are the spiritual lights referred to as the Atzmut, literally the essence of the Sefirot and the Partzufim? After all, doesn't that statement imply that the vessels are not the essence of the Sefirot and the Partzufim? To understand this matter properly, we need to attain an even deeper understanding of the relationship between the vessels and the spiritual lights that they contain. In my opinion, the most appropriate way to parable the relationship between the vessels on the one hand and the spiritual lights that they contain on the other hand, which as we learned are the essence of the Sefirot and the Partzufim, is according to the relationship between our physical body and our Neshama, i.e. our soul. Where am I going with all of this? If we would allow ourselves, for the sake of the simulation, to parable the vessels of the Sefirot and the Partzufim to man's physical body, then that would naturally imply that the Orot, which are the spiritual lights of the Sefirot and the Partzufim, should be paralleled to man's soul, which is his Neshama. And this is why I made the effort to simulate how our soul relates to our physical body. although in truth man's soul is completely invisible, as our sages stated in the Talmud in Masechet Berachot. And when we stop to contemplate for a few seconds, we'll realize that man's soul is indeed our essence, and not our physical body. After all, what man really is certainly his internal makeup, i.e. his soul, and not his external makeup, which is our physical body. And although certainly man's soul cannot do anything whatsoever without the help of our physical body, nevertheless, when we carefully investigate the partnership between man's body and man's soul, by all means we understand that the Neshama, i.e. the soul, is the essence of that partnership and not the physical body. Inasmuch, we should naturally understand that in the spiritual realm as well, it is the internal makeup of the Sefirot and the Partsufim that are appropriately called their essence, and not the vessels which represent their external makeup. And perhaps we can add to that and point out that just as man's soul is a godly element from the upper worlds, what the holy books call Chelek Elokah Mima'al, what we certainly cannot say about man's physical body, which is made out of flesh and blood, then so too in the spiritual realm as well, we find that the spiritual lights of the Sefirot and the Partsufim are also more intimately connected to the Creator, i.e. to the Ein Sof, than the vessels which contain them. And this last insight should certainly hammer in why the spiritual lights are appropriately called the essence of the Sefirot and the Partsufim, and not the vessels. And by the way, note how I intentionally simulated man's neshama both inside of the physical body and surrounding the physical body. And please God, in the next session, we'll clarify how this relationship is also applicable to the relationship between the spiritual lights of the Sefirot and the Partsufim and the vessels that contain them.